worries, inshallah. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Inshallah, my topic today is regarding COVID-19, speaking a little bit about the moral obligations, the social responsibilities, and some of the challenges that we have been facing as a global Muslim community. But before I do that, inshallah, I'd like to take a moment, inshallah, just to thank and appreciate the brothers at MIA, at the Markaz Imam Ahmed. I've never been there in person, but I have people who have attended there for years, alhamdulillah. They're now living in Perth, and there is a strong network, alhamdulillah, of people who I am in contact with, and I would love to visit the center one day, inshallah. Now, of course, this is a very hot topic, and it is a difficult one. It is a very sensitive one for many. My aim today is to take a more unconventional approach to the topic. Perhaps an approach which maybe both sides of the competing elements will not like, because it momentarily sidelines advocating for any position. My aim today is to maybe survey and quickly gloss over the current social, the moral, the ethical discussions in relation to COVID-19, focusing more on the broader picture for us as Muslims. This means that my primary motive will not be speaking for or against vaccinations, speaking for or against the restrictive measures at our places of worship, and whatever other debates many people are getting into. That will not be of primary concern to me today. To do this, I will attempt to do, inshallah, one of two things, or these two things, inshallah. Number one, I will attempt to conceptualize the comprehensive range of social and ethical discussions which Muslims have been having from you can say late 2019 all the way until today. And number two, finding instances and models of moral obligation and social responsibility from our own Muslim sources. Now, of course, we all know that with the lightning speed developments in this, very quickly evolving genre of material, we had many scholars, many ulama, many political analysts, many medical professionals, many policymakers, many governments, many educators, many journalists, many analysts, statistical analysts, and a host of other stakeholders. They've been thrust into the discourse on COVID-19. And we have a whole range of contributors, very creative contributors to the discussion. And with the generating of these discussions since the end of 2019, we have various spectrums of opinion, very polarized opinions on both sides, and a lot in between as well. And we have a whole heap of literature and material that has come out very, very quickly regarding responses to and attitudes regarding COVID-19 around the Muslim world. Many articles, heaps of material, many videos have been produced, many guidance documents from various communities have been produced, and many articles and many material that has been produced. A lot of it represented the lack of responsibility in cooperating for public health and safety. So, much of the videos and these articles and research papers and guidance documents and so on, they will be speaking about how some communities have been lacking in responsibility in cooperating for public health and safety. And we see, over the past maybe 2 years or so, it was very evident in articles which detail responses to coronavirus cases in places like India, in places like Pakistan, in places like Bangladesh, in places like Malaysia, Indonesia, the United States of America, and other places as well. And to a relative degree, you can say as well, the United Kingdom. And more recently, of course, much material was released regarding the opposite, the great responsibility that has been undertaken by Muslim communities in Australia, in places like in Sydney and in Melbourne, and the disproportionate, methods of policing under the pretext of the lack of cooperation and responsibility. And we have other material as well, which speaks regarding the early intervention and the responsible responses of Muslim societies. And they speak about how there have been very proactive measures and how that was seen in many GCC countries like Saudi Arabia, like UAE, like Qatar, like Kuwait, and others. We also see much discussion around battle with COVID in places like Istanbul and in general in Turkey from 2019 until today. And that represents, you can say, like a very comparative, a multifaceted angle with other nations who are considered Muslim majority countries. Their case touches upon the realms of foreign and domestic and the economic policies and the rates of recovery, the administered tests, the rates of death, the number of cases on the ground, in contrast with early projections. We see that it highlights the relative success of Turkey despite their economic deficiencies, and it shows us the role of ideology. It shows us the role of regime, of institution, and of nation states in the responsibility which is shouldered by different Muslim countries. Now, perhaps what we can say is lacking in our context is literature, which involves qualitative, quantitative studies of a similar nature with regards to Western countries, something which is taking place with minority Muslims across the Western world. And this may be due to the lack of administrative or organizational or economic resourcing that is very possible in GCC countries to be able to effectively execute and streamline information and measures with minimal social disruption. And this includes the religious messaging as well. The religious messaging is very streamlined and very effective in places like this. Now, what is interesting is the varied response of various Muslim communities. The varied response of various Muslim communities all around the world. For example, we see very early on solidarity practices and very charitable acts, very socially beneficial acts, very philanthropic acts in the outbreak of COVID-19 in Italy highlights so many initiatives which were taken up by the Italian Muslim community, including the 23 initiatives which were taken up by the Italian Muslim community in fulfilling its religious responsibility in the pandemic outbreak. And this was something which was reported widely in the media as well. And it was something which was applauded by not just Italians, but many people around Europe and many places around the world. Now, we see another example in the scholarly guidance, documents that have been issued by various institutions. One such example is the BBSI, the British Board of Scholars and Imams, I take it. I happen to be one of the international members. Now, their documents It throws very fresh light on the theological and the Islamic legal guidelines on health and safety and cooperation with authorities. They speak about mosques, they speak about communal worship, they give guidance with regards to closing of mosques, with regards to individual worship, with regards to Friday prayers. They speak about religious, religious institution and the relevant, government guidance during the pandemic. They had issued another guidance document that was released, and it was surrounding the ethical and the religious, nature and ruling and the status of the impending vaccines. And it explored the use of ethically questionable ingredients, for example. It spoke about personal responsibility. It spoke about the role of tawakkul, the reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and where we position that even as we take measures. It speaks about conspiracy theories. It speaks about safety concerns with regards to vaccines. It speaks about government impositions in relation to the vaccine as well. And you can say that as a matter of social responsibility, the documents that have been issued by the BBSI and institutions like them, they outline the ethical and the spiritual considerations which are required for restoring clarity in the uncertain climate within the Muslim communities, which you can say the uncertainty is sometimes escalated by very hard and aggressive anti and pro-vaxxer polemics as well. So, it does not really matter on which side of the equation you sit. The polemics, they affect both sides, and they affect how the community reacts as well. In relation to the question at hand, the timely resources which were put out, they encapsulate and they speak to us regarding the moral and the social paradigm that is supposed to be reflected by Islamic institutions, that is supposed to be reflected by masajid and their constituent community members across the Muslim world, including Muslims living in minority situations in the Western world. In Australia, for example, we saw the Australian National Imams Council, ANIC, releasing a handful of guidance documents, a handful of statements. The Fatwa Council of ANIC, we saw them issuing a handful of fatwa which were relevant to some frequently recurring issues. Now, of course, we know that the Fatwa Council in Australia is still in its infancy stage and has a long way to go before it is able to have a social infrastructure which is strong and capable enough to respond efficiently and effectively. And I say this as an ardent member and a supporter of ANIC, inshallah, and many other institutions around Australia. Now, another discussion that really took center stage was surrounding the fluidity or the staticity of rituals. How fluid are rituals? How static are rituals? How fixed are rituals? How fixed are holidays and life events? We spoke about Ramadan, we spoke about Friday prayers and weddings and burial rites, and the restrictions and the religious scope to kind of amend and adapt to the situation. And the reality is that these new rituals were conceptualized. We can say new rituals because they were new forms of carrying out our rituals and our responsibilities as Muslims, which we can say have been designed for this particular instance and these particular circumstances. And they were carried out through a negotiation of religious tenets. So we saw, for example, the discussion on the janaiz, the funerary rites, the funerary prayers in absentia, the janaza al ghaib, and the scope of doing that in the absence of many family members, and with the reality of many restrictions being placed on attendance and the presence of those who want to pray and offer the funerary rites to the deceased. And we saw, many scholarly councils and many scholars around the world. They in fact took the leeway that are to be found in some of the madhahib regarding the general allowances that can be found with regards to the funerary rites. And for example, janaza ala al-ghaib and the prayer in absentia, even as the local prayers are performed with the body. So for example, there might be someone who passed away overseas and they held their funerary rites with the body present, with a very small group of people and with a whole heap of restrictions. And many scholars then would give the family members in other countries around the world to conduct the funerary rites in those types of situations, on the pretext that these are extenuating circumstances. And we found that many such allowances and many such modifications negotiations were made regarding the month of Ramadan, regarding the Friday prayers, regarding weddings, regarding burial rites, and also there was a renewed discussion regarding very intransigent cultures, very you can say very close-minded cultures and religious notions regarding rituals and orthodoxy. What is the sunnah? What is within the framework of acceptability for the Muslim community? And these types of discussions were renewed in the wake of all of these mini discussions taking place in response to COVID-19. Now, some of these developments, they allude to the potential of religion to serve as safety valves and enhancing social order. But that is hampered by a resistance to reform, and that is established traditions, as is evidenced in many of the situations that were cited when events were unfolding around the world. And of course, this has huge ramifications on the question of religion and how it fosters moral responsibility or moral chaos, even moral chaos, and how religion can be a means and a language of having less order and less responsibility in societies. And one other very pressing problem is a problem that was reflected in cases around the world, like in India. The cases in question, they identified media bias, for example, in the reporting, and they identified it as a potential source of enabling xenophobia against the Muslim minority, where it was undermining the space for positive intercommunal relations between the Muslim community and the ruling elite. And this brings into question the ethical responsibility as well of power structures in how they shape their attitudes towards methods of crisis management. How do we manage communities and how do we communicate with them? And how are we supposed to be socially effective in the management of crisis? And it highlights the ruling elite as well and governments as a potential source of problems in the pandemic climate. Now, of course, the situation in Australia is varied, even as we speak of the different states. The situation in Sydney is not the same as the situation in Melbourne. The situation in Sydney and Melbourne is definitely not the same as the situation here in WA. And that is the reality. So this is something that we also need to be very cognizant of, and we need to take into account. Now, another very common theme is the range of impacts that COVID-19 has had on the youth and just people in general. You know, these impacts are true at varying ages and across genders. The boredom, the stress, the isolation, the confusion regarding conspiracy theories, the intake of information, the inconsistencies in mandatory safety measures, the sinking job prospects, online education and how that has affected people and health, and the sacrifice of the anticipated joys of life, of college life, of university life, of school life, of public life, and just attending and being able to go out and exercise and so on, and attend restaurants and so on. These are merely some of the themes that are explored in generating discussions about the social impacts of COVID-19 on Muslims, specifically, but also the society at large. Now, looking at all of this, I think that we can say that I have tried, with the limited time, tried to survey a good comprehensive range of ethical and moral and social discussions that have happened and that are currently happening as well regarding COVID-19. Now, what is the point of this talk? My aim now is to perhaps to take a recourse to a precedence from our own Islamic sources and find a model that informs our practices and beliefs regarding social responsibility and moral obligation. I want to speak a little bit about the plague of Amawas or Amwas. It is something which is frequently cited regarding the current situation that we are in. And many people have looked at these ahadith in our early history, where we find, for example, Al-Jawhari, a very well-known scholar of Islam, he described it as the first plague to afflict Muslims. And it was meant to be, just to give a bit of a brief background regarding as well. And just incidentally, I remember more than a year ago, I think it was early last year, early in 2020, I actually gave a very short, video message to the Muslim community, my local Muslim community, but also maybe benefiting others as well beyond, regarding the plague of Amawas or Amwas and its potential, lessons in our current climate. And I think the reflections that I made there, I still very strongly hold on to them today, which I will mention a few of those reflections which I think are more relevant. So the campaign, the military campaign, was supposed to be in the 18th year of the Hijrah. And this is an incident that is reported by both Bukhari and Muslim and other sources as well. We find it on the authority of Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhu. That Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he set out for Sham, for the area of Levant, and this was for a military campaign. And over there he met another Sahabi, Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah radiallahu ta'ala anhu, where he was informed regarding an outbreak of disease in that area, in the area that they were planning to pursue. And what happened was Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he went through a very, very thorough consultative process. Now, when we read the hadith, and I would really advise and encourage that we go back and we read up on this incident and we read the actual hadith. It is a little bit of a lengthy hadith and there are different versions of it. However, the gist of, I will just give for the viewers the gist of the incident. Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he called a delegation of the Muhajirin, of the early Muslims, the early migrant Muslims from Mecca. And he asked them regarding their suggestions for the possible course of action. There was mixed reaction within that delegation of the Muhajirin. Some of them said, no, we should go ahead and we should have reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and just enter the area. There were others who did not feel the same way, and they gave the advice that no, we should go back and we should not be entering the area until we know that the area is safe to enter. So there was mixed reaction. Then Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he sent them away and he called a delegation of the Ansar, those who received the Muhajirin, those who gave asylum. So this delegation of the Ansar, they had mixed feelings as well. And they gave a varied response. Some of them said, yes, go ahead. And some others, they said, no, let's stay back until it is safe. And finally, Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he called a delegation of new converts from around about the time of the conquest of Mecca. So new Muslims who were perhaps not as, well embedded, you can say, or, strongly integrated within the Muslim community in the sense of spending long years as committed Muslims. We had these people who Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu had asked were Muhajirin and Ansar. And these were people whose commitment levels and whose piety was well attested. And there were people who were promised Jannah. There were the attendees of Badr, the attendees of Uhud, those who pledged their allegiance and so on. And so there were people who were well attested as far as their status and their commitment, to Islam. But this last group of people whom Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu had consulted was a group which was, you can say, much later on and much lesser in stature. And we can definitely say that there were people who are not as attested for their piety and perhaps their place as the other Sahaba whom were already consulted. And we know this to be the case, that even in the Quran we find that those who did hijrah were not equal to those who accepted Islam later on. Those who are from the Ansar, they are not equal to those who came later on. Those who pledged their allegiance in those instances of pledge, they were not the same. And yet we find that this last group who was consulted, they gave a unanimous response. There was no varied response. Their response was, no, this is a matter where we should err on the side of caution. And we should be giving more priority to the consideration of potential harm and err on the side of caution and go back. We should not be advancing further into this area. And so we find that Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu, when he got this advice, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he decided that the best course of action was to take the advice of that final group and from the groups that he had consulted earlier as well, which were telling him that you need to take the precautious executive decision and go ahead with that. And on this, we find one of the Sahaba, he retorted, أَفِرَارًا مِّن قَدَرِ اللَّهِ يَا أَمِيرَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Are you running away from the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, O leader of the believers? And on this, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he remarked that this is not a response that I expected from you. This is not a response that I expected from you. And this indicates to us that Sahabi who had retorted this was someone whose religiosity, whose piety, whose spirituality, whose commitment to Islam, and whose place with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was guaranteed, or something that was well attested. And yet Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he said this, and he also remarked that نَفِرُّ مِنْ قَدَرِ اللَّهِ إِلَىٰ قَدَرِ اللَّهِ. نَفِرُّ مِنْ قَدَرِ اللَّهِ إِلَىٰ قَدَرِ اللَّهِ. And just by the way, Brother Ali, just before this talk, he shared with me a PDF document by one of our very recent and late scholars, Sheikh Al-Allama, Sheikh Taha Karan from South Africa, who very shortly before his death, he had written a work on pandemics, and he outlined some of the fiqh guidelines from our glorious history and from our glorious literature. I advise people to go back to that and to have a look, inshallah. It is something which is really, really beneficial. But my point here today is that in the incident with Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu, we saw that, despite the high level of piety of many of the Sahaba, the last group of the Sahaba who gave a unified response, which was taken up by Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu in this case, and was forwarded as the correct, executive decision to make. This decision was made, despite the piety and the advice of those people who are of a higher caliber, and that their opinion were just opinions, and that this was something that was judged by Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and he made an executive decision. And what it tells us today is that regardless of our religiosity, the positions that we take, the strategic positions that we are taking, and we are taking very strongly perhaps and very passionate about, they should not lead to us being suspicious of each other's motives, of each other's commitment to Islam, of each other's commitment to safety, of each other's commitment to the religion of Islam, and make accusations and have suspicions such as that person is not faithful to Islam. Why would they undermine the rituals of Islam otherwise? These people are not concerned about safety. Why would they be advising and be anti-vaxxers in these types of situations? Now, once again, I'm not saying that we should not be holding strong to our positions and we should not be advocating our positions. My aim here today is not to advocate my position. I have a very clear position, and I have been advocating it at my masjid and in my spheres of influence. And there are imams around Australia and leaders around Australia who are doing exactly the same, alhamdulillah. And that is something that will continue. My point here today is that the lessons that we take from our history with a broader picture of the Muslim constituency and the different attitudes that Muslims have taken in the past and today as well is very reflective of how we should take a broader responsibility as leaders of the community regarding the language we use and the way we deal with our Muslim communities and beyond as well. And there's two things that I think I will highlight, and I will end here inshallah because my time is running out. Number one, we learn that we should maintain a high level of respect for each other and focus more on how we can benefit and help those in our immediate circles and wider community. We should be focusing on how can we help to make the lives of people better, regardless of what you think about, the closure of masajid and the opening of masajid and vaccines and the ingredients in them and the measures which are taken by government, and whether we should be going out to do this or not that, or whether this institution is doing enough or not enough, or this institution is taking this approach or gave that fatwa or whatever it is. Regardless of that, as a Muslim community, we need to realize and take a higher level of moral responsibility regarding our responsibility to each other, where we maintain that high level of respect and realize that we will still hold to our positions and we'll hold to them very strongly and we'll advocate them and we will try to execute them and try to carry them out and follow through with them within our communities. And that is 100% expected, and that will continue to be so. And the call is not to back down from doing this, that we still continue to advocate and we do what we believe to be the right thing to do. At the same time, we maintain that level of respect and at least that level of of respect where we are not suspicious of the commitment of others to Islam and to safety and to all of these other precepts which form the foundations of not just a Muslim but a human being in general. And that our focus should be, when we advocate for these positions, we work in the community to better the lives of those people who are in our immediate circles, perhaps our family members, our colleagues at work, the people whom we work with at universities and schools, and the wider community as well. And at the same time, we also make sure that we don't have that doubt in each other's commitment to religion. And that is, inshallah, the simple message that I would like to advocate today, inshallah. And that perhaps what we can learn from the Sahaba is that there were people from amongst the Sahaba who advanced and who went into those areas and who perhaps even lost their lives. And there were Sahaba who stayed behind and who abided by the advice and the strategy of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, and perhaps they were safe and they were able to carry on and they were able to serve their communities for a longer period of time. Regardless of the situation, in both cases, those who advanced and those who stayed back and those who took a particular strategy or the other, we find that in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, their motives, inshallah, were correct, and inshallah their aim was to work for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and their aim was to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Their aim was for the consideration of tawakkul in Allah and the safety of people and the benefit that they thought they could provide in their particular circumstances. At the same time, we also do say that, yes, there are certain positions which will inevitably have more difficulty in its path. As an example, if something is mandated by government and if people don't comply, there are social and perhaps sometimes legal consequences of those things. And we need to be cognizant that we even as we advocate for positions which will get us into trouble, we have to take ownership of that and say that I am ready to take the trouble. For me, the personal position that I advocate for is the one that I have been advocating, which is that be safe and inshallah get vaccinated and try to do the best you can and try to cooperate with the broader society as well and the governmental factions and so on, while at the same time being faithful to Islam, inshallah, and having those strong sentiments. And inshallah, it is a wider discussion which goes beyond this half an hour, but this is something, inshallah, which I wanted to share, inshallah, with the community, that even as we have these polarized sides on both sides of the equation, let us realize the broader picture. And even as we advocate for our strong positions, let us make sure that we advocate for them and we follow through with them. But at the same time, we keep that broader perspective in mind, and we don't question the religiosity and the commitment of those people to Islam and to safety and to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to the Sunnah and to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He grants us benefit. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He forgive us for any mistakes. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He bless our communities, that He protect our communities. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He give us relief from the difficulties that we have faced as a result of the pandemic the world over. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He take this test away from us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that if He decrees this test to continue, that He give us the strength and the ability to face these tests with faith and with commitment to Him and with acceptance from Him. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His aid and His assistance. Allahumma rabbana atina fid dunya hasana wa fil akhirati hasana wa qina adhab an-nar. Wa jazakumullahu khairan. And I thank you all for listening, and inshallah I hope to visit you one day in person in Sydney and meet all the brothers and sisters there inshallah. Wa jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.